Last year, I got a call from someone in New Zealand government saying, what will happen to this container ship that was wrecked on the North Island? And I said, well, when do you want to know? And they said, well, we want the results now. I said, no, what do you want to know what will happen in 1 year, 5, 10, 60, 100, 200 years? I did a head count the other day, and I've done measurements on 78 different shipwreck sites. So I'm beginning to understand, what it all means. When we dive on a shipwreck, we've got that capacity to journey back in time. It may reveal patterns of human behavior, technological changes, bits of information that we really have very little actual concrete knowledge of. For example, on the aeroplanes inside the Fujikawa Maru hold, corrosion measurements showed that 3 out of the 4 aeroplanes were made of the normal copper aluminium alloy duralumin. But one plane was skinned with essentially pure aluminium. The question was, why? There were no records of the Japanese having made planes like this. By good chance, I came across a 93-year-old manufacturer of these wartime airplanes, and he told me that the Zeros were corroding on the flight deck because of the salt spray that was constantly on them. 3% copper in the aluminium triples the mechanical strength, but it makes it more prone to corrosion. Pure aluminium doesn't have that problem, and so they rolled a very thin skin of pure aluminium on top of the duralumin. Boom, end of corrosion problems for the Japanese fighters on board their aircraft carriers. And unless I had gone in and done those corrosion measurements, no one would have ever known that piece of Japanese aviation history. So, you just never know what you're going to find. It's up to you as a scientist to sit down and work out what the corroding metals are telling you, because the wrecks never lie. For example, I'll tell you about the Australian World War I submarine, AE2. The AE2 was one of Australia's first submarines. Her place in history is that she was the vessel to go and penetrate the Dardanelles. Because she got into the Sea of Marmara, that led to the decision not to pull out of Gallipoli, and the rest is history. During her passage into the Sea of Marmara, the AE2 was often well below her design depth. They have huge plans of it in the Australian Archives in Canberra. But when we went and did the on-site measurements, we found that there were parts of the structure that were held together with double and triple plating that weren't in the plans. That's why the submarine held together when it was put under extraordinary pressure. If they hadn't done those changes, the ship would have collapsed. And the way in which the AE2 submarine turned history around on its toes would have not happened. So that's why the archaeology of these wrecks is incredibly important, because until you go down and measure stuff, you just don't know. I was on a research grant, an ARC grant at Murdoch, and it was running out. I had the offer of a 1-year postdoc in Oregon, or looking at copper corrosion on shipwrecks in the museum. And 37 years later, I'm still at the museum, have 8 different jobs here, and I'm still turned on by a passion for decay and understanding what it all means. Up until then, I had no connection with shipwrecks at all. And I kept asking my boss, Neil North, well, what about this? And what are these parameters like on the wreck site? And he said, oh, you ask too many questions. Just learn to dive and shut up. They found a shipwreck just a few months after I joined the museum. I was taught to dive in Fremantle swimming pool and then had one go on a wreck off North Mole at the North Mole barge. But I tell you what, it's a very different experience when you're 2 kilometres offshore and the boat's heaving up and down and you're told, go and duck dive down 7 metres and pick up a hooker hose, and remember, breathe out when you put the regulator in your mouth, otherwise you get a lungful of salt water. I'm swimming down through this murk, trying to find the hooker hose, following the yellow line and remembering, ah! And then, it was scary at first. On finding a new shipwreck, it is extremely rare to find any evidence that actually gives you a name. You need other bits and pieces to tell you the story. A barrel found on the wreck identified it as coming from Boston. Silver coins on board gave us the date it had left port. Barnacles growing on parts of the wreck told us that the ship had been wrecked on its outward going voyage. And that helped Graham Henderson go to the Boston Public Library and look through the old newspapers. And on his first morning, he found a full detailed description of the loss of the ship. It was the wreck of the Rapid, an American China trader that sank on Monday night, January the 7th, 1811. I learned so much from that wreck. I learned to realize that the artifacts were just waiting for me. All that pain and misery that they'd been through was not going to be lost, because suddenly the artifacts had found someone that they could talk to. Analysis and interpretation of decay patterns can provide a totally unique record of the changing physical environment. The wreck of the Thexantho up at Port Gregory, we found 16 bands of corrosion. The fitting could only corrode when the engine was buried. And so that means the seabed at Port Gregory rises and falls by 2.5 to 3.5 metres every 7 years. So we were able to tell marine and harbours, whoa, stop, do not build a marina there, because in 6 or 7 years you'll run out of water. The Thexantho was a paddle steamer, which was converted into a screw vessel, and it hit a storm. And where the propeller shaft had been put in, the plates there began opening up, so the water began pouring in. That disaster of the sinking of the Thexantho at Port Gregory led the government to build the railway line between Northampton and Geraldton. Now Geraldton's a major port and exporting millions of tons of wheat. And you could put it all down to the shipwreck of the USS Thexantho. We thought initially that it was just an ordinary old steam engine, but it was clear from the drawings Jeff Kimpton made that the 2 pistons, instead of going up and down, were running horizontally. It was the only surviving example of the world's first mass-produced marine steam engine. It is like finding the only example of Henry Ford's first mass-produced car. I mean, it was stunning stuff. My life began in Ballarat in 1948 when I was born 10 minutes before my twin sister. Someone asked my mother, well, who won the Caulfield Cup? And she said, I don't know, I've just had twins. Therefore I know I was born on a Saturday. We used to ride everywhere as kids. We'd ride off to primary school and then ride off to high school and think nothing of riding 15 or 20 miles out to go and see a local volcano or something like that with my brother. We'd also do crazy things like making sleds and going tobogganing down old mullock heaps, because Ballarat was an old gold mining city. The abiding memories were riding my bicycle through snow in the Ballarat winter and watching all the European trees around the lakeside changing colour in the autumn and then bursting back into life in the spring. It really was part of the magic of life. I owe my career in science to my mother. She was a very, very clever woman. We would engage from a very early age in scientific discussion. Whenever I wanted an answer to a question, she would find out answers and explain everything. There was no Google, there was no Wikipedia, there was just Mum. My mother used to act in the Ballarat National Theatre, so as a kid I used to go down and watch her performing. It was really the beginning of a whole life of acting and looking at the challenge of how do you communicate your message to different people to make their history as alive and as interesting as possible. My father was a businessman. He ran a wholesale tobacco, wine and spirit and grocery. During the war, he'd been in military intelligence in the Australian Army. He told me the story that he was ready to evacuate some Australian troops from Crete and needed a sign-off for the ship to leave port. He went to get the paper signed and they said, sorry, you can't disturb the Colonel, he's in case conference. And he said, I don't care. If we don't get this ship out of here, all these Australian troops will end up being guests of the Kaiser. My father kicked the door in and there was the man in charge, absolutely stone cold drunk. So my father pulled out his service revolver, held it to the man's head and said, sign here. And they said, you'll be court-martialed. And he said, catch me, I'll be on the boat. He also had a lot of compassion because in the 1950s and 60s, it wasn't trendy to show support for prisoners, but dozens and dozens of prisoners got their first job after jail with my father. And it meant there was an unwritten rule that no one was to knock off or burgle any of John Macleod's businesses because he looked after criminals. It was great. When you recover artifacts from a shipwreck, for one day's excavation, there may be 5 or 10 years conservation before they're finally all stabilised, documented, catalogued, and in display. Shipwreck objects that have been immersed for hundreds of years accumulate massive amounts of chloride. To stop objects falling apart, you've got to remove the chlorides, and this involves soaking and washing the objects for several years. Very much the idea now in conservation is for in situ preservation. Underwater corrosion can be stopped dead in its tracks by attaching an anode to the artefact. And the anode is nothing more than a great big lump of zinc or aluminium or even something as simple as an old car engine block. What you're doing is transferring the corrosion from the object to the anode. And in the process, because the environment of the metal has changed, the voltage gives the chloride ions one big kick and they say, I'm out of here. And so they go. Instead of having years and years of painful conservation work, you can recover it almost ready-made for exhibition. On the Sirius wreck site on Norfolk Island, where you've got a cannon sitting on top of a reef, we were able to remove more than my body weight of chloride in a matter of 2.5 years. Instead of waiting for 6 years to get the gun, they were able to have it on display in 6 months. The government of Norfolk Island thought that we were pretty cool, but it was all because we'd planned it ahead of time and we'd done the work underwater. In Victoria, you've got the wreck of HMVS, Her Majesty's Victorian ship, Cerberus. It was built in the 1870s as a battleship with 2 rotating turrets with 10-inch guns inside. And wait for this, it had the technology to sink itself and lower itself on the horizon so that other ships couldn't see it as an easy target. Anyway, after hundreds of years of corrosion, the structure of the ship had collapsed. So they decided to take the guns off, but they had to store them somewhere, but also they needed conserving. So what we did was we put sacrificial anodes on them. And so even though the cannon are sitting in seawater, the guns are so stable that when they want to, they just go and lift up the guns and knock the marine growth off, and they're ready for exhibition. We're now in a new digital age. We're in a recording age, and that leads to so much more information than a straight excavation could ever recover. Now that we've got really good 3D recording, we can find out so much more about the past without having to dig it up. The careful work that's done with underwater videography will enable a 3D experience for people who have a passion for shipwrecks. They can actually dive into a wreck on the web and have a truly, pardon the pun, immersive experience and just get some of the magic. One of the joys of diving and working, and apart from the fun of getting corrosion measurements, is just seeing the glory of nature. The shipwrecks, because of all their nooks and crannies, they act as nursery grounds for so many marine organisms. Everything from tiny fish to the batfish, to the rays, to the little sharks, to the big sharks, they all are living in and around the wrecks. Mitochondria, which are in every cell, need iron for their metabolism. And iron, because of the pH of seawater, there's very little of it available. All of a sudden, along comes an iron wreck, and it's like Christmas pudding and everything rolled in together. It's constant food. Marine organisms grow 2 to 5 times faster on an iron wreck. They help fish to live and breed. When we sank HMAS Swan off Dunsborough, how many species of fish were swimming around it? 2. 3 years after the ship had been sunk, when colonisation was abundant, how many fish species? 32. The whole shipwreck becomes an oasis of marine life.
Here is the actual bombing of the mighty USS Arizona by Jap planes. A single lucky hit was responsible for the disaster that befell the Arizona.
I'm one of the few people who's been fortunate enough to dive on the Arizona. When you're swimming up to it, all of a sudden, these giant guns appear out of the murk. The explosion was so intense, it caused something like 5 floors of the Arizona just go vroom down like a pack of cards. Down the aft end of the Arizona, you can see through the murky water of Pearl Harbor the area in the aft turrets where they inter the ashes of former crew members. That was the first wreck where I felt very strongly the presence of the dead. It was very tangible. It was very real. And so while I was underwater, it may sound funny, but I said prayers for the dead. And when I came out of the water, Larry Murphy looked at me and he said, "Ah, I see they've spoken to you." And I said, "Yep." We had a dram and we toasted the crew of the Arizona. And that was a magical moment for me. February the 8th, 1961, which was my first lesson in science class with our science teacher, Mr. John Flynn. He got some red mercuric oxide, put it over a flame, and it went boom! You got this beautiful silver mirror of the mercury condensing. From that moment on, wow! Yeah, that chemistry was just magic. And I wanted to do magic stuff. I guess my hero was Dr. Robert Craig, who taught thermodynamics at the University of Melbourne. Now, most people go, thermodynamics, oh, but he explained everything with such eloquence and elegance that I really got turned on by equations connected it all to a reality that no one else ever did. And that to me was magic. And so years later, I went and wrote to him and thanked him for changing my life. I met a man, the late Professor Tom O'Donnell, who was a fluorine chemist. They had a danger laboratory, which was on the roof in case it blew up. Fluorine and hydrogen react explosively together in any proportion. So once when the fume hood broke down in the middle of a fluorine reaction, I had to climb inside the fume hood. And all around me, these little explosions of bang, bang, as pockets of hydrogen and fluorine would bump into each other. There are 2 types of fluorine chemists, quick ones and those that don't get results. From the University of Melbourne, 7 years there, I went to the University of Glasgow, to the laboratory of another fluorine chemist, Professor David Sharp, and I was making a compound to try and look at its catalytic properties, and there was a flash, and the whole reaction blew up in my face. My lenses in my glasses went to dust, and I was bleeding like a slaughtered pig. So I just pulled myself together, because my mum had always taught me, if ever you have a bad cut or someone chops off your hand, just hold it together and it'll stop you losing too much blood. So always my mum's wisdom was there even when I blew myself up. I got a telegram from the late Jim Parker at Murdoch University saying, I can offer you a job as a research worker, as a postdoc. I had students in the second year of Murdoch, and some of them have gone on to do quite well. Once one of the students fell asleep in one of my classes, so I stopped and walked over to him, gently shook him on the shoulders and said, "Look, I know interfacial phenomena may not be all that exciting, but you will need to know this." And he said, "Oh, no, Ian, it's just that I haven't seen my girlfriend for 6 months and she came down from the Pilbara last night." And I said, it's all right, go back to sleep. Come and see me tomorrow and I'll give you all the notes." And it was he who went on to become head of research and development for Alcoa in America. So, something sunk in. Trying to predict how a shipwreck is going to behave is impossible unless you have a model. And the problem was that there was no model for general iron shipwrecks. Here were 65 shipwrecks, all sunk within 2 weeks of each other. And so we might at last be able to find some systematic trends. The initial survey in 2002 was done over a large number of wrecks, so we could get a bit of a feel for how quickly they were degrading. And then again in 2007 and in 2008. From our work, you could calculate how fast the wrecks were corroding for the first time ever. So that was incredibly exciting. We calculated that some significant parts, for example, of the Fujikawa Maru wreck and the Sankisan Maru would undergo significant decay. Tick, tick, dom, they've gone. The real problem about the decay is potentially there are several 100,000 litres of fuel on board the shipwrecks inside Chuk Lagoon. Those fuel tanks are dangerously thin, and this could well cause physical collapse and a sudden release of the fuel. And that would be a complete and utter disaster. That would kill all the fish life, and there'd be no more food for the people in Chuk Lagoon. If you went and coated the island beaches with oil, that would be the end of their tourism and the end of their economy. On some of the vessels like the Hoyo Maru, you can actually see now tiny little bubbles of fuel oil coming out, and it puts an iridescent film on the waters of the lagoon. There is this insidious legacy from the Second World War. Unless you intervene, corrosion is just steadily going on, tick, 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 day and night. It doesn't stop for anyone. It's a matter of trying to get people to understand the seriousness of the situation. The Prime Minister of Chuk went to New York and spoke in the United Nations about the problem and asked for help. And so far, no help has come. Time is running out, either to remove the oil or to use sacrificial anodes and stop the corrosion. I will begin working with the Australian government. We go to the island, collect all the old car engines from the abandoned vehicles, melt them down and make them into anodes, and then go and attach them to the wrecks. Using anodes would enable us to stop any further corrosion of the fuel tanks, and that will give us breathing space to dispose of the oil. Analysis has shown that there are some unique bacteria there. By genetically modifying them, we'll be able to train them to eat the oil, and so that will solve the problem once and for all. So that's my plan. Museums could not manage their shipwreck programs without the active support of volunteers. There are many volunteer maritime archaeological associations, and they work in conjunction with the museum, maritime archaeologists and conservators. The volunteers bring a huge range of skills: documentation, underwater mapping, visualization, and research. They even write apps for your mobile phone, so no matter where you are, you know where to find the nearest shipwreck. We lend them equipment and they'll go and do measurements for us because we've trained them. Together we work to preserve our wrecks and to make sure that we know as much about them as is possible. Diving on these shipwrecks is really important because when people are properly trained and sensitized, they get much more out of it. They love the wrecks, so they become servants of the wrecks and do their best to help them. I've had to hang up my diving boots, but we don't stop communicating about the wonders that the shipwrecks provide. The more people that get to hear that message, the happier the wrecks will be. Oh. I love data. I really got turned on by equations. I hate curves. I like straight lines. Oh, there's a shot. Pretty cool.